The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and lies. Jalen Carter, 24, sat on the edge of a sterile bed, his heart pounding as his mother, Evelyn, adjusted his fake four-line with practiced precision. "Smile for the cameras, baby," she whispered, her voice syrupy but sharp. "This is our ticket out." Jalen's stomach churned. For 2 years, he'd played the part of the dying son, his shaved head and pale makeup fooling everyone. Charity donors, church groups, even the local news. His parents, Evelyn and Marcus Carter, had spun a tale of terminal leukemia, raking in thousands from sympathetic strangers. But the truth was worse than the lie. They'd forced him into the scam to hide who he really was. Jalen was gay, and in their conservative Chicago suburb, that was a sin they couldn't afford to let slip. So they buried it under a fabricated tragedy, turning their son's identity into a secret worth more than his life. He stared at the linoleum floor, his hands trembling. Tonight, everything would change. Tonight, on live national TV, Jalen would unravel their web of deceit and his own silence. The Carters' house in Oak Park was a shrine to appearances. Framed family photos lined the walls, each one a carefully curated lie. Evelyn, 48, with her polished smile and church lady dresses, was the architect of the scam. Marcus, 50, a stoic auto mechanic, played the grieving father with chilling ease. They'd always been strict, their faith a rigid cage, but when Jalen came out at 18, their control tightened like a noose. "You're not that way," Evelyn had hissed, her eyes cold. "You'll ruin us." The cancer story started small. A fundraiser at their church, a tearful plea for medical bills. Jalen, still reeling from their rejection, went along, desperate for their approval. But the donations poured in, and so did the greed. Soon, they were coaching him on how to look sicker, how to cry on cue. They shaved his head, gave him pills to make him weak, and paraded him at events. The community ate it up, calling him brave, while his parents pocketed the cash. Jalen hated it, but he was trapped. Coming out would destroy the lie and his family's reputation. Worse, it would mean admitting he'd been complicit. So he stayed silent until he met Mateo. Mateo Alvarez, 26, was a barista at a downtown Chicago cafe, all warm smiles and sharp wit. Jalen first saw him on a rare day out, when he'd slipped away from his parents' watchful eyes. Mateo's laughter, bright and unforced, cut through Jalen's fog of shame. They talked for hours that day, Jalen spilling fragments of his truth. Mateo listened, his dark eyes steady, never judging. "You're not their puppet," he'd said, his voice soft but firm. "You're enough as you are." Their relationship grew in stolen moments, late-night texts, secret walks along Lake Michigan. Mateo became Jalen's anchor, the one person who saw him, not the sick kid or the dutiful son. But the closer they got, the heavier the lie became. Jalen couldn't keep faking cancer while falling in love with someone who valued truth. And Mateo deserved better than a life hidden in shadows. The breaking point came when Evelyn announced their biggest scheme yet. A live TV appearance on Hope Rising, a national talk show that championed inspirational stories. They'd been invited to share Jalen's battle and appeal for more donations. The producers promised a massive audience, and Evelyn's eyes gleamed with dollar signs. "This is it, Jalen," she said, gripping his arm. "Don't mess it up." But Jalen had other plans. Mateo had been pushing him to break free, to reclaim his life. "You don't owe them your silence," Mateo told him one night, their hands intertwined under a streetlight. "You're not their lie." Those words burned in Jalen's chest, fueling a resolve he hadn't felt in years. He contacted the show's producers in secret, promising a story they'd never forget. They didn't know the details, only that Jalen had something explosive to share. The morning of the broadcast, Jalen woke with a knot in his stomach. He stood in front of his bedroom mirror, staring at the stranger he'd become. His head was still shaved, his skin sallow from the makeup Evelyn applied daily. But his eyes, they were alive with defiance. He thought of Mateo, waiting for him in the audience, and felt a surge of courage. This wasn't just about exposing his parents. It was about reclaiming himself. At the studio, the lights were blinding, the crowd a sea of expectant faces. Evelyn and Marcus sat beside him, their smiles polished to perfection. The host, a woman named Clara with a voice like warm honey, introduced them with a montage of Jalen's journey. Clips of him in hospital beds, at fundraisers, looking frail but hopeful. The audience teared up, oblivious to the truth. Clara turned to Jalen, her eyes soft. "Jalen, you've inspired so many with your strength. What do you want to say to everyone watching at home?" His heart thundered. This was it. He glanced at his parents, their faces frozen in anticipation. Then he looked at Mateo, seated in the front row, his expression a quiet anchor. Jalen took a breath, his voice steady but raw. "I'm not dying," he said. The studio went silent. Evelyn's smile faltered. Marcus's jaw tightened. Clara blinked, caught off guard. Jalen pressed on, the words spilling out like a dam breaking. "I don't have cancer. I never did. My parents made it up to scam people out of money. And they forced me to go along with it because they didn't want the world to know I'm gay." The audience gasped. Evelyn's hand shot to her mouth, her eyes wide with panic. Marcus gripped the armrests, his knuckles white. Clara stammered, trying to regain control, but Jalen wasn't done. "I've spent years living their lie, hiding who I am to protect their image. But I'm done. I'm gay, and I'm in love with someone who makes me feel whole. His name is Mateo, and he's here today. I'm not ashamed of who I am anymore." The crowd erupted, some in shock, others in applause. Mateo's eyes glistened, a proud smile breaking across his face. Evelyn stood, her voice shrill. "Jalen, stop this. You're confused." But Jalen didn't flinch. "No, Mom. You're the one who's confused if you think you can keep controlling me." Clara, recovering, leaned forward. "Jalen, these are serious accusations. Can you tell us more?" He nodded, his voice steady now. "They started this when I was 18 after I came out. They said my truth would ruin them, so they created this lie. They shaved my head, gave me pills to look sick, and told me what to say. Every dollar donated went to them, not me. I was too scared to say no until now." The studio was chaos. Producers scrambled in the wings, unsure whether to cut to commercial. Evelyn sobbed, her face buried in her hands, while Marcus stared ahead, silent and rigid. The audience was a mix of outrage and sympathy, their murmurs rising like a tide. Jalen turned to the camera, his voice soft but unwavering. "To everyone who donated, I'm sorry. I didn't want this. And to anyone out there hiding who you are, don't. Your truth is worth more than their lies." As the show cut to commercial, Mateo rushed the stage, pulling Jalen into a fierce embrace. The world blurred around them, the noise fading. For the first time in years, Jalen felt free. But freedom came with a cost. Backstage, Evelyn was hysterical, screaming about betrayal. Marcus refused to look at him, his silence colder than any words. The producers were already talking about legal action, and Jalen knew the fallout would be brutal. Social media was exploding, some called him a hero, others a fraud. The donations, totaling over $200,000, were now under scrutiny, and his parents faced potential charges. As they left the studio, Mateo held his hand, their fingers laced tightly. "You did it," Mateo whispered. "You're free." Jalen nodded, but his chest was heavy. Exposing his parents was only the beginning. The world now knew his truth, but what came next? Could he rebuild a life from the ashes of their lies? And would his parents ever see him as their son again, or just the boy who brought their world crashing down? The Chicago skyline glittered through the cafe window where Jalen and Mateo sat the next morning. But the city's pulse felt distant, drowned out by the storm in Jalen's mind. His phone buzzed relentlessly. Texts from old friends, notifications from ex-posts calling him everything from brave to traitor. The live TV bombshell had ignited a firestorm, and Jalen was caught in its center. Mateo sipped his coffee, his eyes scanning Jalen's face. "You okay?" he asked, his voice a quiet tether. Jalen forced a smile. "I don't know what okay even means anymore." He'd spent the night in Mateo's small apartment, unable to face the house in Oak Park. His parents hadn't called, but their silence spoke louder than any argument. The weight of what he'd done, exposing their scam, outing himself to millions, pressed against his chest like a bruise. The cafe, a cozy spot in Wicker Park, was their sanctuary. Its mismatched furniture and warm lighting felt like a shield against the chaos. But even here, Jalen felt eyes on him. A woman at a nearby table glanced over, her phone angled as if recording. He shifted in his seat, tugging his hoodie up. "People are staring," he muttered. "Let them," Mateo said, his tone defiant. "You told your truth. That's more than most people ever do." Jalen wanted to believe him, but the fallout was relentless. X was flooded with clips from Hope Rising, his words echoing across the platform. "I'm gay, and I'm in love." Some users praised his courage, sharing rainbow emojis and stories of their own struggles. Others were vicious, accusing him of exploiting a fake illness for attention. One post with thousands of likes read, "He's as guilty as his parents." Crocodile tears. The comments stung, but not as much as the ones about Mateo. Strangers called him a homewrecker, as if Jalen's family hadn't already been broken. The legal storm was brewing too. The show's producers had contacted the authorities, and the Chicago PD was investigating the Carter scam. Jalen had spent hours on the phone with a lawyer, a pro bono advocate named Sarah who specialized in fraud cases. She warned him he could face charges for his role, even if coerced. "You were a victim," she'd said, her voice calm but firm. "But you'll need to prove it." Prove it. The words haunted him. How do you prove a life of fear? The pills his parents gave him to look sick were long gone, flushed down the toilet in secret. The fundraisers, the hospital visits, all staged with no paper trail tying him to the truth. His only evidence was his story, and half the world didn't believe it. Mateo reached across the table, his hand covering Jalen's. "You're not alone in this," he said. "I'm here. Always." Jalen's throat tightened. Mateo's steadiness was his lifeline, but it also scared him. What if this ruined Mateo's life too? He worked 2 jobs, barista by day, freelance graphic designer by night, to afford his tiny apartment. He didn't deserve to be dragged into this mess. "What if I'm not worth all this?" Jalen whispered. Mateo's eyes flashed with something fierce. "Don't you dare say that. You're worth everything." Their moment was interrupted by a news alert on Jalen's phone. A local station had dug up more dirt. Evelyn and Marcus had been running smaller scams for years, from fake car repairs to church fundraisers that never materialized. The report mentioned Jalen's name, calling him the whistleblower's son. He felt a strange mix of pride and nausea. He'd exposed them, but at what cost? That afternoon, Sarah, the lawyer, called with an update. "The police want to talk to you," she said. "They're building a case against your parents, but they need your testimony. It's not going to be easy, Jalen. They'll ask about everything. Your role, your motives." Jalen's stomach dropped. Testifying meant reliving every moment of the lie, every time he'd let his parents manipulate him. It meant facing them in court, their eyes boring into him. But he thought of Mateo, of the life they could have if he broke free for good. "I'll do it," he said. The rest of the day blurred into meetings with Sarah, drafting statements, and dodging reporters outside Mateo's apartment. By evening, Jalen was exhausted, his nerves frayed. They walked to a quiet pier on Lake Michigan, the water reflecting the city's lights like scattered stars. Mateo slipped his arm around Jalen's waist, pulling him close. "You're stronger than you know," he said. Jalen leaned into him, the cold air sharp against his skin. "I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm falling apart." "Then fall," Mateo said softly. "I'll catch you." They stood there, the world's noise fading, until Jalen's phone buzzed again. It was a text from his sister, Kayla, 19, who'd been away at college during most of the scam. "I saw the show. I'm coming home. We need to talk." Jalen's heart sank. Kayla had always been the golden child, blissfully unaware of their parents' schemes. What would she think of him now? The next morning, Kayla arrived at Mateo's apartment, her eyes red from crying. She was petite, with their mother's sharp cheekbones, but her expression was softer, raw. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I would have helped you." Jalen stared at the floor. "I didn't want you to hate me, or them." Kayla shook her head. "I don't hate you. I'm mad you went through this alone." She hugged him, fierce and sudden, and Jalen felt tears prick his eyes. For the first time, he realized he might not lose everyone. But the relief was short-lived. That afternoon, a process server knocked on Mateo's door, delivering a summons. Evelyn and Marcus were suing Jalen for defamation, claiming he'd fabricated the entire story to disgrace them. The news spread like wildfire on X, with hashtags like Carter Scam and Jalen Lies trending. The lawsuit was a desperate move, but it hit hard. Jalen's credibility was already shaky, and now his parents were painting him as the villain. Sarah was unfazed. "This is their last stand," she told Jalen over the phone. "They're trying to scare you into silence. We'll fight it." But fighting meant more exposure, more scrutiny. Jalen's past was being dissected online. Old photos from fundraisers, clips of him looking sick. Some donors demanded refunds, others sent him death threats. Mateo stayed by his side, filtering the worst of the messages, but Jalen could see the toll it was taking. Mateo's boss had already warned him about the cafe's image if the media frenzy continued. That night, Jalen lay awake, Mateo's steady breathing beside him. He thought of the years he'd spent hiding, the love he'd almost lost, the truth he'd finally claimed. He'd exposed his parents, but the cost was mounting. Could he keep fighting without losing himself or Mateo in the process? The courtroom loomed like a stage for Jalen's reckoning. The wooden benches, the judge's stern gaze, the murmur of reporters. It all felt like a twisted encore to his TV confession. He sat beside Sarah, his hands clasped tightly, as Evelyn and Marcus stared from across the room, their faces masks of righteous indignation. The defamation lawsuit was in full swing, 2 weeks after the Hope Rising broadcast. Evelyn and Marcus had hired a slick lawyer, a man named Gregory Holt with a penchant for theatrics. He painted Jalen as a troubled liar, a son who'd invented a scandal to spite his loving parents. Jalen Carter is no victim, Holt declared in his opening statement, his voice booming. He's a manipulator who profited from this alleged scam and now seeks fame by destroying his family. Jalen's chest tightened. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, curious locals, even a few donors who'd given thousands to the Carter's cause. Their eyes bored into him, some skeptical, others pitying. Mateo sat in the back, his presence a quiet anchor, but even he couldn't shield Jalen from the weight of Holt's words. Sarah countered with precision, presenting text messages Jalen had saved, Evelyn instructing him to look weaker at events, Marcus demanding he delete any texts about the scam. She called witnesses, a nurse who'd noticed inconsistencies in Jalen's treatment, a church member who'd overheard Evelyn bragging about donations. But the evidence was circumstantial, and Holt was relentless, twisting every fact to fit his narrative. The worst came when Evelyn took the stand. She cried on cue, her voice trembling as she described Jalen's rebellious phase and how his confusion about his sexuality had led to lies. "We only wanted to help him," she said, dabbing her eyes. "We never forced him to do anything." The jury leaned forward, some nodding sympathetically. Jalen felt sick. She was rewriting history and people were buying it. Mateo met him outside during a recess, his face tight with anger. "She's lying through her teeth," he said, pacing. "How can they believe her? They don't know her like I do," Jalen said, his voice hollow. He felt the old fear creeping back, the fear that no one would believe him, that he'd always be the villain in their story. But Sarah had a plan. "We need to put you on the stand," she told Jalen that evening in her office, a cramped space filled with legal books and coffee cups. "Your story is our strongest weapon. You have to make them feel what you went through." Jalen hesitated. Testifying meant baring his soul, reliving every moment of shame and coercion. But he thought of Mateo, of Kayla, of the life he wanted, one where he didn't have to hide. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's do it." The next day, Jalen took the stand, his heart racing. Sarah's questions were gentle but direct, guiding him through his story. Coming out at 18, his parents' rejection, the cancer lie they forced on him. He described the pills, the shaved head, the constant fear of being found out. His voice broke when he talked about Mateo, how loving him had given him the strength to fight back. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," he said, tears spilling. "I just wanted to be me." The courtroom was silent, the jury's faces unreadable. Holt's cross-examination was brutal. He grilled Jalen on why he hadn't spoken up sooner, why he'd accepted the donations. "You enjoyed the attention, didn't you?" Holt pressed, his tone mocking. Jalen's hands shook, but he held his ground. "I was scared," he said. "I thought I'd lose everything." After his testimony, the tide began to shift. Ex-posts started trending in his favor, with users sharing stories of family coercion and hidden identities. A hashtag, Stand with Jalen, gained traction, and strangers sent messages of support. But the victory felt hollow. His parents still refused to speak to him, and Kayla, torn between loyalty to them and love for Jalen, was struggling to cope. Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy intensified. Reporters camped outside Mateo's apartment, shouting questions about Jalen's motives. One night, a brick sailed through the window, a note attached, "Liar." Mateo brushed it off, but Jalen saw the worry in his eyes. "This is my fault," Jalen said, his voice cracking. "I dragged you into this." Mateo grabbed his shoulders, his gaze fierce. You didn't drag me anywhere. I chose you, and I'd do it again. Their love was a lifeline, but it was tested daily. Mateo's boss fired him from the cafe, citing too much drama. Jalen felt guilt gnaw at him, but Mateo was unshaken, already hunting for freelance gigs. We'll figure it out, he said, his optimism a stark contrast to Jalen's fear. As the trial neared its end, Sarah uncovered a bombshell. Bank records showing Evelyn and Marcus had funneled donations into a hidden account. The evidence was damning, and Holt's defense began to crumble. The jury deliberated for 2 days, and when they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Evelyn and Marcus were guilty of fraud. The defamation suit was dismissed, and they faced criminal charges. Jalen should have felt triumphant, but all he felt was grief. His parents were escorted out in handcuffs, Evelyn sobbing, Marcus stone-faced. Kayla, sitting beside Jalen, squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face. They did this to themselves, she whispered, but her voice shook. That night, Jalen and Mateo sat on the pier again, the city's lights reflecting their fragile hope. What now? Jalen asked, his voice barely audible. Now we live, Mateo said, pulling him close. For real this time. But living wasn't simple. The world knew Jalen's story, but not everyone believed it. And the scars of his parents' betrayal ran deep. Could he heal without their forgiveness? And could he and Mateo build a future when the past still haunted them? The weeks after the trial were a blur of noise and silence. Jalen and Mateo moved into a tiny apartment in Uptown, scraping together rent with Mateo's freelance work and Jalen's new job at a community center. The world hadn't stopped talking about them. Ex-posts, news segments, even a podcast dissecting the Carter scandal. But Jalen felt like he was living in the aftermath of a storm, picking up pieces of a life he barely recognized. The community center job was a lifeline. Jalen worked with LGBTQ youth, kids who reminded him of himself at 18. Scared, hiding, desperate for acceptance. He listened to their stories, shared bits of his own, and found purpose in their trust. But every night, he came home haunted by his parents' faces in court, their anger searing into him. They'd been sentenced to 5 years for fraud, with restitution ordered for the $200,000 they'd stolen. Jalen wasn't required to repay anything. Sarah had argued he was a victim, but the guilt lingered. Kayla was his only link to the family now. She visited often, bringing takeout and stories from college. But her visits were bittersweet. She was grappling with her own anger at their parents, torn between love and betrayal. They keep asking me to tell you they're sorry, she said one evening, her voice hesitant. I don't know if they mean it. Jalen's heart twisted. I don't know if I can forgive them, he admitted. He wanted to. God, he wanted to. But the years of lies felt like a wall he couldn't climb. Mateo was his rock, but even their relationship felt the strain. The media attention hadn't faded, and neither had the threats. Someone spray-painted fraud on their building, and Mateo's social media was flooded with hate. He stayed strong for Jalen, but Jalen saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he double-checked locks at night. I'm fine, Mateo would say, but Jalen knew better. One night, Jalen found Mateo staring at his laptop, his face pale. What's wrong? Jalen asked, dread pooling in his stomach. Mateo turned the screen. A blog post, shared thousands of times on X, claimed Jalen had planned the scam himself, using his parents as scapegoats to launch a fake redemption arc. The comments were vicious, calling for Jalen to be jailed, for Mateo to leave him. It's just noise, Mateo said, closing the laptop. We know the truth. But the noise was deafening. Jalen's job at the community center was at risk. Some parents complained he was a bad influence. He felt like he was drowning, the world's judgment heavier than his parents' lies. Maybe I should have stayed quiet, he told Mateo, his voice breaking. Mateo knelt in front of him, his hands cupping Jalen's face. You spoke because you had to. You gave those kids at the center hope. You gave me hope. Don't let them take that away. Jalen clung to those words, but doubt gnawed at him. He started seeing a therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Nguyen who helped him unpack the years of coercion and shame. You're not defined by their choices, she told him, or by what people say online. Slowly, Jalen began to believe her. Meanwhile, the community rallied in unexpected ways. A local LGBTQ organization reached out, offering Jalen a platform to share his story. He hesitated, fearing more exposure, but Mateo encouraged him. Your voice matters, he said, not just for you, but for everyone who's still hiding. Jalen agreed to speak at a fundraiser for queer youth. The event was held in a small Chicago theater, packed with supporters. Standing on stage, Jalen felt exposed, but he saw Mateo in the front row, his smile steady. Jalen told his story, not just the scam, but the years of hiding, the fear of losing his family, the love that saved him. The audience listened, some crying, others nodding. When he finished, they gave him a standing ovation. Afterward, a teenage boy approached him, his voice shy. I came out to my parents because of you, he said. They're trying to understand. Jalen's throat closed up. For the first time, he felt like his pain had purpose. But the past wasn't done with him. One evening, Kayla called, her voice urgent. Mom's in the hospital, she said. She had a panic attack. They're letting her call one person, and she wants you. Jalen froze. He hadn't spoken to Evelyn since the trial, hadn't seen her since she was led away in handcuffs. Part of him wanted to refuse, to let her face the consequences alone. But another part, the part that still remembered her tucking him in as a kid, couldn't let go. He drove to the hospital with Mateo, his hands shaking on the wheel. Evelyn looked small in her hospital bed, her face pale without her usual makeup. She reached for him, her voice weak. Jalen, I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't know how to love you right. Jalen's eyes burned. He wanted to scream, to ask why she'd chosen greed over him, why she'd let fear win. But her frailty stopped him. I needed you to see me, he said finally. Not your version of me. She nodded, tears spilling. I see you now. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Jalen left the hospital feeling lighter, like a knot in his chest had loosened. Mateo held his hand as they walked to the car, the city's lights blurring around them. You okay? Mateo asked. For the first time, I think I might be, Jalen said. But the world wasn't done testing them. A new ex-post was gaining traction, claiming Jalen had faked his hospital visit to Evelyn for sympathy. The lies kept coming, and Jalen knew they wouldn't stop. Could he keep fighting, or would the noise drown out his truth? The Chicago winter settled in, sharp and unforgiving, but Jalen felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. He and Mateo stood on the pier where they'd shared so many moments, the lake now edged with ice. It was 6 months since the trial, and though the scars remained, Jalen was learning to live with them. The lies online hadn't stopped, but they'd lost their sting. Stand with Jalen had grown into a movement, with thousands sharing stories of overcoming family rejection and societal pressure. Jalen's talks at community events had become regular, each one easier than the last. He'd even started a blog, writing about his journey with raw honesty. The first post, titled My Truth, went viral, shared by strangers who saw themselves in his words. His relationship with Evelyn was fragile but growing. She wrote him letters from prison, each one a small step toward accountability. Marcus was colder, his letters brief and formal, but Jalen held out hope. Kayla was their bridge, visiting both parents and Jalen, her loyalty unwavering. "We're still a family," she told him one day. Messy but real. Mateo had found steady freelance work, his designs featured in local galleries. He and Jalen were saving for a bigger apartment, dreaming of a life less shadowed by the past. But the biggest change was in Jalen himself. Therapy had helped him see his worth, not as a victim or a liar, but as a man who'd fought for his truth and won. One evening, Hope Rising invited Jalen back for a follow-up. He hesitated, memories of that first broadcast still raw, but Mateo convinced him. "Show them who you are now," he said. So Jalen returned, this time with Mateo by his side. The studio felt different, less like a battlefield, more like a stage for closure. Clara, the host, welcomed them warmly, her questions kind but direct. Jalen spoke about the trial, the hate, the healing. He held Mateo's hand, unashamed, and talked about their love as the anchor it was. "I used to think I had to hide to be loved," he said. "Now I know love doesn't ask you to be anything but yourself." The audience cheered, their support a stark contrast to the chaos of his first appearance. Clara revealed that the show had started a fund for the defrauded donors, using ad revenue from Jalen's episode. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was a step toward justice. As the show ended, Jalen looked at Mateo, his heart full. They'd faced lies, hate, and loss, but they'd come through together. The cameras caught their quiet smile, a moment of resilience that said more than words ever could. Back at the pier that night, Jalen pulled Mateo close, the city's lights reflecting their shared strength. "We made it," he whispered. Mateo grinned, his breath visible in the cold. "We're just getting started." The future wasn't perfect. There would be more challenges, more voices trying to tear them down. But Jalen knew now that his truth was stronger than any lie. He'd exposed his parents, not out of revenge, but to reclaim himself. And in doing so, he'd found a love, a purpose, and a life worth fighting for.